Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit about my research and hopefully stimulate some thought on the part of our attendees regarding ways we can do research to capture individual level behaviors more accurately. So what I'd like to do, let me go to here, we go. What I'd like to do is, I guess you've all had your microphones muted now, so I appreciate that. And I'll stop and ask questions a couple of times in the middle in case there are questions, and then we'll have time at the end for more. To begin with, we recognize that information system topics exist at individual level, group level, organizational level, or even industry or societal level. And so these are just some individual level IS research topics that people have evaluated. Things like technology adoption, online voting, auction bidding behavior, social media behavior, HCI design, and many other phenomena where we study individuals using computers. Now, if you think about the individual at work, the employee, could be the home user as well, but you notice that they have an interaction with the organization, their employer, they're the managers of their company. And there's a level between there. We can study the interaction between the individual employee and the firm that they work for. And that's where firms use various methods to influence their employees to engage in the behavior they want. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in how organizations can influence their employees to practice better cybersecurity behavior. To do that, we have to measure cybersecurity behavior. So these are some of the threats. I won't read each one, but there are many threats to individuals, both at work and at home, that we see today. Hackers and accidental disclosures and all kinds of other things that can happen. Here are some security activities that are discretionary, not automated. Now, many of the activities that we once did manually, such as scanning for viruses, are not needed anymore. So what we do now is automate as much as we can, but remember that we are still, each one of us, individually responsible for some of these activities. And let's just look at that first one. There's a huge problem globally with ransomware attacks where individual employees are clicking on links they shouldn't click on and download malware to their company's servers that creates the ransomware attack. But look at the bottom, logging off, locking doors, shredding documents. Some of the information security behaviors don't even involve computers, such as closing your door when you discuss something sensitive with someone so that no one else can overhear it. Now, when I'm a chemist or a physicist or an engineer, I have very good measures. I have things like thermometers and spectroscopy and other devices that measure things very accurately. But in the behavioral sciences, unlike physical phenomena, we don't have those. We measure latent constructs, things that can't be directly measured. I can't put a thermometer in your head and measure the level of trust you have in technology. I can't put a pH strip and find out what your level of acceptance is of technology or how you perceive it and so forth. So we have to measure things indirectly many times, which is why we call them latent constructs. Now, keep in mind that McGrath talked about the three-horn dilemma. We can either maximize precision, realism, or generalizability, but never all three. So unless you engage in a multi-method research project where you have two or more studies, you can always have some weakness in your research, and you're always playing with that trade-off between precision, realism, and generalizability. So when we do lab experiments, we have more control. We're more precise, but it's not as realistic. When we're in the field, we have more realism, but we give up control. Now, information security behavior is a variety of things that people have studied for 2 or 3 decades, but I'm focusing primarily on compliance with security policies, that second bullet. How do we get employees to act safely or have better cybersecurity behavior in the workplace? But also many of these things apply to home computer users as well. And of course, there are white hat behaviors and black hat behaviors. So we want people to act properly, but there's also insider abuse. Now, this is a diagram in one of my MIS quarterly articles in which I identified the threats to information systems. And if you focus on the upper part up here, you will see that we are focusing on internal human threats that range all the way from passive non-compliance, forgetfulness, through volitional, meaning you're doing it, but you're not doing it for malicious reasons, such as failing to log off, for example, or not changing passwords, all the way to intentional malicious abuse like computer fraud or embezzlement. Now, keep in mind also that the behavior is a continuum all the way from minimal compliance or minor non-compliance all the way to the extreme. So at this extreme is this very malicious activity, an insider who sells sensitive information to a competitor, for example, and all the way at this end is very proactive extra role behavior, organizational citizenship behavior, where you go above and beyond, maybe to help new employees understand how they can be more safe with computing. I'll stop for a second at a couple of points, but since we got a little bit late start, I'm going to continue now, and then we'll see if we have questions at a later stopping point. Now, I want you to think about one thing as we proceed. Do individuals make actual cognitive, deliberate, rational choices about their actions? Are they actually decisions they make? Are they considering the risk and reward? Think about the theories that we're going to be using to study cybersecurity behavior. They all presume this rational process of thinking about what you do before you do it. So the two primary theories are deterrence theory and protection motivation theory. And deterrence theory comes from criminology, which basically says if you punish people, they will not do it so much. And protection motivation theory says when you know there's a threat, you will be less likely to expose yourself to that threat. So they both require some rational, conscious thought. This is a diagram from Straub and Welke that talks about the security action cycle. I won't spend so much time with that, but if we can deter people from acting by creating some kind of threat of punishment, they'll be less likely to do it. This is also from a MIS Quarterly article. If you look at T0, that's when the insider abuse happens. We want to look to the left of there, look back in time and look at these pre-kinetic events that led to the formation of intention that leads to the actual computer abuse event. And so we're interested in the antecedents, those things that lead up to why an employee would engage in online abuse with computers. The fear appeal, so this is deterrence theory. I won't go into detail there, but basically the idea is having policies that create the perception of sanctions, that employees know they will be punished. And fear appeal, based on PMT, basically says the more severe the threat, the more susceptible you are to it, the more likely you will view the threat as something you should cope with. And then to cope, you have to have response efficacy. You have to believe the response will work, and you have to have self-efficacy. You have to believe you can do it. So it is serious. It can happen to you, but this response will work and you can do it. This is the model we published in 2010 in an MISQ article that's been cited widely. And basically it leads to behavioral intent. Yes, we measured as our DV a self-reported intention to engage in anti-spyware behavior. Clearly not the same as measuring actual behavior. In the United States, we have two different approaches to get people to wear seatbelts. One was the crash test dummy. Some of you may have seen where it crashes into a barrier and the head goes forward. The other one is if you don't wear your seatbelt, you could get a ticket and pay a fine. So this one is protection motivation material. I don't want to die. And this one is deterrence theory. I don't want a ticket. So this diagram essentially summarizes how I view my research stream, which is that I have been measuring behavioral intention that leads to these behaviors of cybersecurity hygiene. And there are factors that influence my intention. And one of them are dispositional factors like my personality and my values and morality and my motivation. And the other one are these situational factors that are external to me. So things like what my boss tells me and what kind of organizational sanctions I have and what kind of communications there are to influence me. And then there are moderators of both. So how do we measure the behavior of interest? First of all, we have self-reported behavior. I have done this. I have changed my password and selected strong passwords, for example. But we know that's subject to social desirability. People answer the way they think you want them to answer. Then we have behavioral intention, and that's subject to what Podzakov calls common method bias, which is where we measure things about cybersecurity behavior and others with a scale. And Detmar Straub called this low-hanging fruit. It's just too easy to measure, and it's full of biases and problems. And then there's actual behavior, which could be both positive and negative behavior by, for example, electronic data gathering with logs and cameras and so forth. In the United States, we have the IRB, which is our ethics board, and they won't let us do much of this. Same thing is true in Europe. Same thing is true in Australia now. You really just can't watch people's behavior without their permission. It's against ethical rules in our academic settings. Not so everywhere in the world, but it is increasingly in other countries adopting these ethics standards. The other way we can measure actual behavior is to have a qualified observer report it, such as a boss. And we've done that in one of our studies that I'll talk about. And we know that intention behavior are linked, but there is some subjectivity and there are some problems with measuring intention. And there are challenges. Now, Zhengchuan Xu, Qinghu, and Zhang measured how hackers in China form their intention to hack by interviewing them. But what about server logs? Is that something we can do? Well, that's a problem, as we just talked about. And I'll take this opportunity to stop my share for just a second and see if anyone has an initial question. Okay, I don't see any, so I will go back to share. Okay, all right, let's continue then. So what I would like to do is talk about some experimental research designs, factorial survey method, neurophysiological methods, lab and field experiments, experiments using games, experiments using deception, and briefly some other ones if we have time. So the first thing I want to talk about is the factorial survey method, where you manipulate the independent variables as versions of a different scenario, a base scenario. And it's borrowed from criminology research. And the DV is essentially, what would you do if you were that character in the scenario or vignette? And it's a 3-item scale. You know, I would do as Joe did and so forth. Now, this is not actually measuring real behavior, but it separates the person from some of the problems with self-reported behavior or intention, because you're not actually asking, what would you do in this situation, but what would you do if you were that character? So you present various background versions of the scenario that manipulate the IVs, and then you are not really answering about yourself. You're sort of removing yourself and answering as if you were someone else. Okay, so it overcomes that social desirability bias. So this is a paper we published in Information Systems Journal in 2018. That looks at antecedents of this negative behavior from organizational justice and other things. So what are these pre-kinetic events? The one we looked at primarily are the perceived organizational injustice, which is when an employee feels the employer has not been fair, has not given them a proper raise, for example, or isn't treating them fairly compared to other employees. And then we also looked at the techniques of neutralization, which are justifications that people use to allow themselves to engage in violation behavior without feeling guilt or shame. So we use these all the time. We say it's okay to go a little over the speed limit because it doesn't hurt anyone, for example. And so we allow ourselves to violate norms and laws sometimes by using these justifications called techniques of neutralization. So this is the basic model, and we have this behavioral intent, but we're going to measure it in this unique way that I just mentioned. And then this is our injustice, and then these are moderators related to these techniques of neutralization. I'll mention metaphor of the ledger because that one's kind of interesting. Metaphor of the ledger essentially says, I know I've been such a good employee for so many years that I'm okay to do this one bad thing this one time. You know, in the scheme of things as a ledger, I've been such a great employee that it's okay to break the rules this one time. So this is an example, and I won't read the whole scenario, but we are manipulating various things in these various versions, okay? And so when they read the scenario, Joe didn't get the raise, he didn't think it was fair, or he did think it was fair. Look at the end, it says, he thought his chances of getting caught and punished are low, but if caught, punishment would be severe. So we manipulate that. This is certainty low, severity high up here. Now, after they read the scenario, did Joe feel it was fair? So we have a manipulation check, and then the realism check. And then here's our 3-item scale. In that situation, I would do the same as Joe. If I were Joe, I would have looked at the data that way. I think I would do what Joe did if this happened to me. So what we have now is a traditional 3-item scale that we can do convergent discriminant validity on, but we're not really asking, what would you do? You're kind of saying, if you were Joe, what would you do? And now people can be a little more honest. So here's another version. We had 24 versions. And this time we have some other manipulations. And here's another one where we change things to punish below minimal, and it was process was unfair, etc. So we change all these different scenarios and then ask them this same question: what would you do if you were Joe? Okay, and these are some of the papers that we've published using this factorial survey method in some of the top journals in the information systems field. And so it's an interesting way to be able to measure someone's intention more fairly than just asking them directly. Next, I'd like to talk about neurophysiological methods. And these are methods of measuring things more objectively rather than subjectively. So functional magnetic resonance imaging, EEG, eye gaze, eye location. What do you look at on the screen? Eye duration. We watch your eyes as you watch the screen. Galvanic skin response. When we exhibit certain behaviors, we sweat a little more, and you can measure that on the hand. Hormone production, emotion sensing from facial measures. We can measure fear. We can measure joy, happiness, shock, etc. And I'm standing here in front of a MRI machine. We did a study a few years ago that we published in JAIS, where we looked at different parts of the brain when we subjected individuals to information about threats and about the responses to threat. And these papers are all easily available through Google Scholar or other methods. And if any of you has trouble finding any of these papers, feel free to email me and I'll send them to you. But what we did is we wrote manipulations that the subjects read while they were in this magnet here, very still, and this is where their head is, where my hand is resting. Their head lays in there, and as they're reading things about computer threats, security threats, and also responses about how you can back up your data in case you have a hard drive crash, for example, then we looked at what areas of the brain responded. And I won't go into detail there, but it's something you cannot really lie about. You can't really fool the technology. If your part of your brain that is associated with certain emotions or certain cognitive processes lights up, then you can't control that, like you can lying on a survey, for example. So it's more subjective. Now, these next few slides come from the Brigham Young University Neurosecurity Lab. There's the URL, neurosecurity.byu.edu. And you can see that we can track what you look at on a screen. We have one of these labs at Mississippi State now as well. We don't have this website, but we have these same technologies where we can put subject into a computer environment, watching the screen, and watch where their eyes are tracking, what they look at on the screen. We have skin conductance, we have EMG, we have EEG, ECG. We can't do the cortisol, but that's the hormone. And then there are brain imaging tools like PET scans, EEG, and MRI. So all of these methods are designed to essentially measure neurophysiological responses to stimuli. The techniques, of course, are widely used in medicine and in other fields. We're interested in MRI, we're interested in the function of the brain. So we look at it over time, rather than just looking for a tumor or a broken bone or something that doctors look at, physicians look at. We're interested in seeing how your brain will respond over time, how it functions when exposed to different messages and other stimuli. There's a great article by Renee Riedel, Fred Davis, and Al Hebner that describes the methodology that you can look at and learn more from. And they talk a little bit about how we can triangulate on phenomena by using traditional measures, traditional instrumentation, and also using MRI and other neurophysiological methods. So I recommend that 2014 article in JAIS. I'll stop now and see if there are some questions. You can also put questions in the chat mode, and I see that we do have some chat.
Warkentin, there's a question for you. in the chat window.
Yes.
She's asking, would you kindly provide an example of one of the settings where we were able to measure security-related actual behavior of users with an IRB approval? Was there any manipulation applied in an actual behavior settings?
Yeah, I'm about to talk about some of these. So the MRI is one where the behavior is not an actual security behavior. It's a brain response to security threats and security responses. Next, I'll talk about lab and field studies that we've done, and also a few that others have done. And then I'll talk about how we can use deception and games to capture real behavior. So I will show all those next. And then there's a new question that just came up that said, how does the cybersecurity effects on the MRI result in accuracy? I'm not sure I understand the question as it's stated, but we do know that we can very accurately measure brain activity. I'll elaborate on that just briefly. Brain activity is something that we can measure with a high degree of high degree of spatial acuity, but a low level of temporal acuity. What do I mean? Spatial acuity, we can measure the brain down to a single neuron. We call it a voxel, V-O-X-E-L, which is like a three-dimensional pixel. And we are able to measure when an individual neuron in the brain fires. Now, what does that mean when it lights up and fires? That means it's taking in hemoglobin. It's doing uptake of blood, of hemoglobin, to refresh after it's been activated, after it's fired. Now, what we know is that there are, of course, millions and millions of these, and we measure them at very small slices of time, but we don't know exactly how long it takes for that hemoglobin uptake to occur, and what the lag is between the stimulus and the uptake. So we have to do what we call repeated measures in the experiment. So we repeat over and over and over, and then collect lots of data from those repeated measures, and then take averages. And that way we can actually see what's happening in the brain following various stimuli that we subject the subjects to. And I think that's it for all the questions. Some of the other ones are about the certificate. So I'll continue to share my slide now, and we'll have more opportunity again later to engage in some questions. Thank you for those questions. So next I'll talk about lab experiments and field experiments. And these are some of the studies we've done. In the lab experiment I'll talk about, we put people into a computer lab, had them play an exercise, told them they'd get a reward. And then for half of them, we actually temporarily cheated and didn't give them their reward. So they got frustrated, and then offered to help by breaking the rules of the game. That worked. We were able to frustrate the half that got the treatment. Of course, in the end, they all got their reward. And then we do various field experiments here that I'll talk about briefly. So let's see. We have slides. Okay, I want to talk about this one here. This was a field experiment we did that we published in Decision Support Systems. We went in front of large audiences and we told them that there was a new computer virus called Z code, and that they could fight Z code by downloading our program called Z Alert that would scan their computer for this new virus. IRB made us made us tell them to keep using their Norton or Symantec or others. They were afraid people would stop using their traditional one because, of course, there was no Z code. It was really deception. And we actually got a large number of people to download our Z Alert, which did nothing. All it did was show this little progress bar. It didn't actually do anything. But then we told them they had to do it every week. And once they quit using it, once they stopped, then we surveyed them about why they stopped. Okay, let's see. So that's one process we did with deception, the Z code example. We have several papers where we had the subjects playing games, and then the game captured their behavior. So they were actually engaged in a game where they were competing for rewards, and then we subjected them to security manipulations and tested their response within the game. One of them was Facebook, and one of them was another environment. Mark Keith at BYU has developed some apps that subjects actually download, and then it tests their location behavior. So he published this in Information Systems Research in 2016. And Mark and his colleagues have done several other ones where the users actually engage in some behavior with that app, and he is able to collect that behavior about their location and about their disclosure with the app. I have a similar paper right now with Rob Crossler and Greg Bott, where we actually got people to download an app to their Android phones, and then we captured behavior and captured data off their phones about their privacy disclosure. Here are some other studies that we did. I mentioned the MRI study. The Leader's Dilemma game is one of the games that we had them play. Years ago, I published a study with colleagues where we had them learn a new kind of password, and we tested whether this checkoff password system was what worked or not, and they actually had to remember their password. And if they did remember their password, we gave them a chocolate candy bar. And so we actually had them try to remember this password versus 3 other types of passwords to see how easy it was to use and measure their response to this kind of approach where they had to use a graphical system. We had a personality study where we had them fill out a survey about the big 5 personality and then had them go home and scan their own computers to be safer. And so we measured whether they actually would go home and literally log onto their computer, which we could track. They agreed to do this. And so we knew which kind of personality would be more likely to go home and be safer by running this scan of their computer. We published this continuance study that I'll talk about. I think I have that coming up. No. Let me mention the continuance study. That's the Z alert. The idea there was to measure the degree to which they would continue to use this protection scan, and when they quit, why would they quit? So it was a measure of continuance or discontinuance. And then I have a current paper under review right now with Jordan Shropshire and Detmar Straub, where we measure the DV by measuring the direct supervisor's assessment. And we did this in 2 environments in the United States. One is healthcare, where nurses must comply with a privacy standard called HIPAA, some of you know about, that protects patient information privacy. And the other one is in banks, where we have a lot of regulation as well, where banking information is protected information. So we know that bank employees and healthcare employees, like nurses, must protect this information. And of course, if we ask them to self-report their behavior, there would be social desirability. Of course, they would say, yes, I'm very safe. However, what we did is we measured their behavior with a complex instrument we developed that their direct supervisor answered about them. So we linked their surveys with their direct supervisor's rating. And then, of course, we took out all identifiers, so the data were anonymous. But that direct supervisor is in a position to observe their behavior. Did they close the door? Did they shred the paper? Did they log off? Did they exhibit all these various activities about security? And moreover, the direct supervisor's job is to ensure compliance. So they were not only in a good position to measure it, they were responsible for the security of their employees. So it was a measure of an observer direct assessment. Let's see, Boss et al. And MIS Quarterly had 2 studies where they tracked actual backup behavior and the reaction to fake malware. I had a field study measuring actual user behavior that I published with Goel et al. This was sponsored by the National Science Foundation. If we have time, I'll mention it in a later slide. And there are studies that have done phishing simulations where they phish employees and see whether they will in fact click on a phishing link that's simulated, that doesn't actually steal their data, but just to see if they'll click on it. We can also look at archival data from organizations. Angst et al., a paper that I accepted for MIS Quarterly, captured hospital security investment data. Wang et al. Looked at unauthorized access attempts, and there are other studies that we can talk about. I'll be glad to share those with anyone who wants more information. Here's the Angst article. I know you're recording this, so you can look that article up. Here's a Sony breach. Again, this is a paper that I handled as the senior editor at MIS Quarterly, where they looked at user compensation once people had their data breached. And so they looked at the response of users who had been compromised. Lori Craner at Carnegie Mellon has looked at some really interesting information about people's passwords. You can look up Lori Craner's work. This is really interesting. Joe Valasich at Arizona and his doctoral student, Jeff Jenkins, who's now at BYU, and some of their colleagues have done a number of different studies about how people you can detect people's online deception by how they move their mouse, which is really interesting. And to start with, they looked at response bias, whether or not people will answer in a way that they think they should answer. So they started even with just students. They now have, by the way, a company, they have patents, they have clients. It's a very successful commercialization of their idea. But initially they looked at students answering a survey. So imagine, so look at this mouse action here. Okay, no, no. Okay, you know, you can see by the mouse action that someone is thinking. I'll do that. I'll play that again. Watch this. Okay, have you ever filed for bankruptcy? Well, you know they want you to say no, but some people might lie. But there's a little bit of hesitation there. And so what they did is they looked at question completion time, answer switching, which is where you go back and forth, hovering and editing, and movement accuracy. So that, you know, how quickly do you go right to the answer? So this is another interesting example. They start, this, the screen pops up, their mouse is here, they go right to, some would agree, and then the next screen. Okay, so there's no hesitancy there, there's no answer switching, there's no hovering. They somewhat agree, and then they answer. But now watch this next one. Okay, oh yeah, this one was 6 seconds. Okay, here's the next one. So now, instead of going directly to somewhat agree and then end, let's see what happens here. Okay, so what they do is they go to neither agree or disagree, somewhat agree, they go back and forth, and then they go disagree, and then they realize the student says, oh, attending class is valuable, I better agree with that. That's what my professor thinks is the right answer. And they go all the way over here and then proceed. But Jenkins and Valisitz are able to measure this mouse movement. And of course, you can imagine how insurance companies, when people file false claims, immigration service, when people lie about their background, bank loan applications, many different businesses are interested in measuring this actual behavior. So this one took 12 seconds instead of 6. They did multiple switches, hovers, and so forth. Now, we have limited time, and I should ask whether I should maybe skip some of the remaining slides. I know we had a late start. I am more than willing to stay beyond time. Some people may have to leave. I do want to make sure there's time for questions, so I'll stop one more time for questions in a minute. And feel free to let me know otherwise. These are just some of the things we're looking at, and it's important for all of you to think about this question. Are our behaviors intentional and rational? Do you make every decision when you drove to work today and you decided which route to take? When you made a decision about how to save your money? Or more importantly, when you made a decision about what to eat for breakfast, what to whether or not to open a window, whether or not, you know, everything we do is not always a conscious, deliberate, rational thought. The scientists actually say that over half of the actions that we exhibit are governed by things like habit or irrationality, or maybe rational, but governed by things that aren't so deliberate and carefully attended to. We're not always engaging our cognition. So one of the things is framing effects, you know, the gain loss prospect theory, non-conscious behavior, you know, system 1 kind of behavior, the endowment effect. And I've had a number of studies looking at these. It's very difficult to measure, but we've done some of these already, looking at some of these factors. So I'll talk real briefly. This is a paper that we published in JAIS, and we just got another one accepted at INM, where we looked at herd behavior. So I'll talk about herd behavior. So first of all, bounded rationality. We know that people don't fully engage their cognition, and they sometimes take shortcuts and apply heuristics. So what is herd behavior? Herd theory says that if you have uncertainty, you'll follow the herd because others know more than I do. And we do this when we consider what stocks to invest in or what restaurant to go to. If you see everyone going into a restaurant that's popular, you think, oh, they know something I don't know, I'm going to try that restaurant. So imagine here, which software to download. You look at 149 million downloads versus 2 million downloads. You look at the star ratings, and this might tell you something because other people might know something I don't know. And so if we have uncertainty and we observe others and we discount our own information, and then we might imitate others, is this irrational? No, it might be actually very rational to say other people know more than I do. But it's not the same as the conscious, deliberate thought of ourselves. So we have the protection motivation theory concepts where I view the threat and the severity and decide my own ability to engage in a response. And then we have these herd factors where I discount what I know, like I don't know as much, and then I imitate other people and I engage in protection motivation. So what we did briefly is we did a 2-group experimental design with control and treatment, where the control group got no information about the popularity of this password manager Dashlane, and the treatment group received the popularity information, how popular Dashlane was, how many people were using it. And then we validated that they used it for 1 week and then collected data again. So we did a sort of a, not really a longitudinal, but a 2-stage data collection. And then they engaged into this actual security behavior, and then we measured their responses about various things afterwards. And again, we published that in JAIS. Again, I won't have time to go into all the details of this one, but we actually used prospect theory, which basically says losing feels worse than winning feels good. And you might remember this cartoon that says, if you donate money, this cute bunny will live happily ever after. And it says over here, if you don't donate money, this cute bunny will die. And of course, they're the same thing. Either the bunny lives or the bunny dies. But depending how you frame it will affect the perception of the message recipient. And so what we did is apply this theory to real employees in a real company. They either started out with money and then we took it away if they violated, if they, for example, clicked a link they shouldn't have clicked on, or they started out with no money and we added money to their account once they did good things or avoided bad things. So one was gain and one was loss. So this is my final question break before I do some final slides if we have time. I have unshared my screen. I will make sure we share it again. It is now about a quarter till the hour. If there are some questions now, I'll take them. I'm looking at the chat. Okay, mobile health apps, sensitive information, HIPAA, HIPAA, by the way, does cover all personal health information between any healthcare professional, a doctor or a nurse, and their clients, whether or not it's on a mobile app or whether or not it's on a website or whether it's face-to-face or on paper or US mail. So in the United States, HIPAA does cover the protection of all health information. So healthcare providers all ask me for a release to give them the right to share my information. Of course, people who are sick give up their privacy much more readily than people who are healthy. It's an interesting phenomenon. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to sort of go through my last slides.
There's one more question from one of our colleague. Maybe we can take that question. Dr. Saqib, you want to ask question now? We will unmute your mic, so please, you can ask question.
Yeah. Hello, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for the nice, wonderful session. So I have, a question, basically 2 parts. So one part is that, to study human behaviors now, many researchers are using diary studies. So what's your take that how effective will be diary study to do a longitudinal study, if specifically in the context of, user behavior in the security?
And what kind of studies did you say? Say that word again.
The diary studies where you...
Oh, yes. diary, yes.
Yeah. Secondly, when we generalize these case studies, there is always issue with generalizability. Mm-hmm. I would like to have your take on that when you are generalizing those field studies and case studies, so how effective is specifically to the, security domain?
Okay, so the first question about diary studies, I think they're interesting. I think they're probably more valuable if they're done in the context of a 2-study or 3-study paper, because they are flawed. Going back to McGrath, if you think about it, a diary study is really self-reported. So if I keep a diary throughout my day of how often I engage in some behavior, it's up to me to properly record it, self-report it, and of course there will be errors, there will be some deception, maybe some social desirability bias. It's not like I have server logs or a third party observing me as I keep this diary. Now, the more you can make it unobtrusive and guarantee anonymity and so forth, the better the data will be, the more valid the data will be. There was a study done by some Yale researchers about social media behavior a few years ago, where they had their subjects agree to answer a question about how relatively happy they are at the moment. So randomly throughout the day, the app would come on, and they would have to go to their phone, and on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are they? And of course, what they also measured was how recently did they check Facebook. And of course, the research showed that when they checked Facebook, their happiness went down, not up. It was not a good experience. And so they actually were able to statistically analyze happiness levels in conjunction with how recently they had checked their Facebook account. So that's like a diary study, because randomly throughout the day, they would get this little pop-up, and they may not have even realized the purpose of the study. Your second question was about, remind me. Should have written it down.
About generalizing the case.
Oh yeah, generalizability. Yeah, again, my objective going forward is to do as many studies as I can with multiple studies, multiple methods to increase generalizability. When you do a lab study, it's very artificial, and it's difficult to, you have more control, but than you do in a field study. But you're right, the generalizability is difficult. So imagine if you're doing a field study with just one company, like a very in-depth case analysis, and maybe it's even multi-method. Maybe you interview people, you have focus groups, Delphi, and surveys. So maybe it's multiple method, but it's all in one organization. So on the one hand, you're controlling for all kind of factors that could be different in different organizations, like org culture or the rules and so forth. So that's good. But on the other hand, how can you generalize from Aramco or General Motors or any one company to the cultures of many other companies? So there's a big advantage of collecting data, whether it's surveys or field experiments, from people at hundreds of organizations. But then you introduce these other variables and give up control. So there's always this trade-off between, the precision and the generalizability. If you haven't read McGrath, I encourage you to read it. It's very thought-provoking. The rest of the questions seem to be about the certificate and scientific materials and so forth. So I'm going to return to sharing screen. Hopefully we'll have it right here. Let's see, share. Are you now able to see my screen? Yes. Okay. So the following few slides, which is the end of my talk, comes from a working paper I'm working on with Detmar Straub and Ali Vedati, and we're working for these for MI's quarterly submission. And we are identifying 15 alternatives for collecting data that can inform our understanding of security. And I won't go through all of them, but I just want to elaborate about a couple of them. So number one is serendipitous, things you collect for other reasons, captured, server logs, video cameras, cookies, IP addresses, password changes, surfing behavior, things that might be captured for other purposes. And if you have access to these logs, you could study them. And this reduces the bias and what's known as the Hawthome Effect, where people act differently when they know they're being watched. So if I can get access to that kind of data anonymously, like Lori Craner has at Carnegie Mellon, then I can study behavior with all of these methods. A third one is evaluation by others, a qualified third party, which I mentioned in our paper. And so we measure behavior that's not captured elsewhere, like logging off workstations or shredding documents or something like that. Number 5, business process data, like transaction logs. How people file their paperwork in a business context. This is very reliable and does show regulated compliance and so forth. 6, external business process data. In the United States, we have to report to our companies that are publicly traded, all the ones where we can buy stocks in them, they have to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so it's formal reporting of security investments and accounting data and various other things. Dialogue or discourse. Anytime there's a conversation between two people that's recorded, like in a chat or a narrative or a forum or some kind of discussion database, committee reports, transcriptions, maybe legal environments. Anytime this is captured, it can provide insights into individual behavior. Individual narratives from anthropology, and then some other methods we've talked about a little bit with legal documents, media reports, and so forth. So these are all some various ways that we're elaborating on right now to collect data besides just surveying people or engaging in older methods that are now under attack. So my closing thought for you here is, what are the key metrics we want to measure? Keep in mind that the bar is continually being raised at our journals. Those of you in the audience who are academics, who are publishing, it's very difficult to get published in MIS Quarterly or ISR or ISJ or our top journals. Things I published 10 years ago, I couldn't publish today. Wouldn't be good enough. So you need to be creative. And that's why some of the people that have published some really interesting and valuable research about cybersecurity behavior have done just that. They've shown real creativity in how they collect that data. That's my encouragement to you. And I will stop sharing now and take any additional questions. Someone has asked, does capturing the mouse movement without user's agreement, is it not considered an ethical issue? That's a very good question. Now, ethical issues are required under IRB if you're an academic researcher. And this goes back to, things the Nazis did and the Tuskegee studies and so forth. So there are many bad things that happened in the past when people did scientific research on people without their consent that did harm. So clearly, all of us, every one of you would think it's very wrong to capture somebody and subject them to dangerous drugs without their approval to see if it'll kill them or not or something. That would be so wrong. As a scientist, I need to exhibit ethical behavior. However, when I'm applying for a loan, the bank loan officer is not a scientist, and it's a voluntary behavior. The person is applying for a loan and they are expected to answer honestly, then it's completely ethical, in my opinion, to measure whether or not they're being honest. You would do the same thing if someone was in front of you and you asked them a question. You would try to judge by whether they look like they're lying or not, by their eyes, whether or not they seem truthful. This is really an extension of that. This is essentially measuring whether or not somebody may be telling the truth or not. It's not completely dispositive. You need to use other methods, but it does indicate perhaps the need to follow up. And so I think it is ethical in that kind of context. Applying for a visa, applying for a credit card, applying for a job, that makes perfect sense to me. Someone asked, how will the behavior study impact or enhance cybersecurity? Yeah, that's a really good question. We try to apply our work to the real world with every study. I'm of the belief that knowledge has its own value for its own sake. People win Nobel Prizes, not just for curing cancer, but for discovering how a cell wall works. It might be useful later, it might not, but I believe that knowledge has its own value. That having been said, I believe that my research has direct application to how companies can help employees be more secure. So when we understand the reasons why somebody is more motivated or why some messages work better than others, then that can be directly applied by managers to craft messages that will influence their employees to be more secure. I'm looking if there's any others. I see people thanking me. I want to also extend my thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy day to attend my talk. I hope to meet some of you in the future at conferences or when we travel. I trust all of you are safe in this time of global pandemic, and it's been my pleasure to speak with you. I'm happy to stay and answer more questions if there are any. Yes, and again, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate you taking your time.
Thanks, Professor Merrill. And now I'll request my dean to thank you and also the audience and conclude the session, please.
Thanks, Professor Nasser. I'm trying just to activate the camera. It seems there is an issue. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I would like to welcome you all with you, Dr. Abdulrahman, the Dean of College of Computer Science and Information Technology at Imam الرحمن University, and the Chair and the Supervisor of Saudi Aramco Cybersecurity Chair. I would like to thank you, Professor Nasser, for the moderating of the session. I would like to thank our today distinguished Professor, Dr. Merrill, for accepting our invitation and for sharing his valuable knowledge and addressing the audience questions. We are happy to see today the talks attracted 170 plus attendees, and I would like to thank them for their interest and for joining us for this session. We are looking forward to collaborate with Professor Merrill in the future. I believe we have a lot of projects related to human factor security, and I believe his valuable experience will help us a lot in this project. Looking forward to meet the audience in our future series lecture. And thank you all for your interest and for joining us. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dean Abdullah.
Yeah, so I just typed the next session that will be held after 1 month. I wrote the title in the chat window for everyone. Those people who are interested, we would love to join them, welcome them again in the next session. It will be about integrating machine learning in cybersecurity development and challenges. So I hope to see you in the next seminar of this series after 1 month. Thank you, everyone.